All right. I hope you enjoyed the video. Good morning. My name is Cindy Macias. I am the Division Chief for Foster Care and Adoptions with Hillsides. And I want to welcome you on behalf of the Foster Together Network, a public-private partnership working to improve the recruitment, retention, and quality caregiving in LA. I am very honored to be here today, and I am hopeful that you will all enjoy today's presentation. I hope that you walk away feeling empowered to create some change. We have a great session that focuses on overcoming bias to improve recruitment, retention, and quality care. This is one of many sessions that we've had over the past month. During the last several months, issues of racial disparity and inequity have really come to light. I've heard the saying, in the darkness, you see light. This was very hard to see. I couldn't really see the silver lining in everything that was happening. But I'm going to share a short story about my organization. I've been with Hillsides for 19 years, and we've taken implicit bias trainings, but never had we had such a proactive approach. After the killing of George Floyd, the civil unrest, and the protest, we were proactive, and we quickly created a work group that was representative of every single division in our agency: foster care, short-term residential treatment services, community center, community services, support services, human resources. And the goal was to really have all our representatives go back to the divisions and make some changes in our practices and really be proactive in this. We also, years have had our all-staff survey. This is how we create goals. And this year we actually included questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and questions about how safe staff feel to share about their their identity, their culture, their gender, or any issues of discrimination in our workforce, and if they had ever felt discriminated against. These were very provocative questions. We created a manual so that supervisors can go back into every single department and talk to their teams about racial disparity. And then in one of our all staff meetings, we had about 500 employees. And again, you know, we have never brought this up from this lens. So we showed a quick video. It's a YouTube video called How to Get Home Safely, 10 Rules of Survival. This was a video that was produced in 2015, but yet still very relevant to today's times. And it talks about how to basically be safe if stopped by law enforcement. And we learned a lot from this. We had very strong reactions. There was some staff that were happy and excited and felt that we were taking a stance and we were proactive and they were proud. And then we also had other staff members who were very upset. They were offended, and they voiced how happy they were about us taking a stance and portraying law enforcement in a negative light. That was never our intention. So we learned a lot from this, and most importantly that, you know, we will make mistakes, but that silence doesn't help, and that we have to prepare our staff, we have to give them the tools, and we have to provide a comfortable, safe, and trusting environment where people are respected and build trust to talk about these issues within our own workforce, within our communities, with our resource parents. We also learned that, you know, this is just part of the nature. These aren't things that we have historically talked about, and it's going to bring up issues, but that we're still going to be proactive and talk about things and have a space and allow people to have a voice, raise awareness, and learn from each other. So, you know, we will continue our journey. We just had the first vice president-elect, and so I know this will take time. It may take years, but I think that change will occur, just like we're seeing what's happening now within our own country. This has been happening for the past several years, and now we see a very positive outcome where it will change, where we may have a female president in the future. So we want to thank our county and community partners and families working to ensure equity and love for our children. Thank you to the Pritzker Foster Care Initiative and the Ralph M. Parsons Foundation for sponsoring this event, and to the co-producers of the event, Rochelle Alley of Big Orange Splat and Rambo House, for making today possible. We also want to thank other partners who provide funding for the Foster Together Network's broader work, the Keck Foundation and the Weingart Foundation. Next, I want to introduce Karen Richardson. She has a wealth of knowledge and experience in child welfare. She has a long history working with out-of-home care and the Department of Children and Family Services. Karen received a bachelor's in sociology from UCLA and a master's in social work from USC. In July of 2020, she was assigned to lead the Administrative Support Bureau, which includes the Contracts Administration Division, Out-of-Home Care Management Division, Continuous Quality Improvement, Leadership and Staff Development Division. Karen is committed to fostering positive outcomes for children while supporting caregivers, service providers, and staff. So thank you so much for being here and joining us today. We have a great session lined up for today. So Karen.
Thank you so much, Cindy, and good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Being a Black woman, issues around equity have impacted me personally, and it has been my commitment to have the courageous conversations about why equity needs to be at the forefront of the work that we do here at DCFS. Listening to Cindy reminded me of when we first began to talk about disproportionality in our department, and we had a mandatory management training about 10 years ago called Undoing Racism. Unfortunately, the training did not get the feedback we expected. There were many people who were upset, thinking that we were saying that they were racist. And that wasn't the case. And unfortunately, it halted the conversations that we were having in our department about disproportionality and disparity. So we took a moment, stepped back, look at the data to see what we were finding, asking questions, what was happening, why it was happening, and what we were going to do about it. So what we did was we talked about having honest conversations and looking at what we need to do and make change in our department. We were fortunate to have our new director, Bobby Cagle, join us in the end of 2017, and started to have trainings around implicit bias. These trainings helped because we all realize that we all have biases. We also have equity as a key pillar, our Invest LA strategy, which is to help improve systemic issues around issues of promoting children, youth, and families in our county. One of the most courageous things we did was develop an Office of Equity. And this office is charged with addressing issues of racial and gender equity, in addition to equity issues around LGBTQ children and families. While we've developed strategies in the past about dealing with racism and issues of equity around children of care and color, we always look at the children who are already in care. And one of the exciting things that we're going to be doing through our Office of Equity is taking a look at how we prevent children of color from coming into care. And we're very excited about that and looking forward to working with many of you on this Zoom meeting to address these issues in our county. We've been extremely fortunate to have the support of our Board of Supervisors and staff to deal with issues around equity in our department. One of our biggest supporters is Emily Williams, Senior Policy Deputy to Los Angeles County Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, who represents the 2nd District. As you know, there will be a change in leadership in the 2nd District, so I wanted to personally thank Emily for all she has done to support our department and the work that we've been doing, especially me personally in our work with recruiting, retaining, and supporting our resource families. Emily earned a BA in Political Science from UCLA and an MPP from the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. She was recognized as Alumna of the Year in 2005 and as a past recipient of the YWCA Harbor Area and South Bay's Racial Justice Award. I'm very thrilled to welcome Emily Williams so that she may share a few words with us this morning.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate that kind introduction, and good morning, everybody. I want to make sure that you can hear me and that you can see me okay. Just give a wave if you can. It's been a pleasure to be associated with all of you and to work very, very challenging, sort of the challenging issues that surround child welfare and vulnerable families and children and youth in Los Angeles County. And it gives me a lot of joy to be able to speak for a couple of minutes about the supervisor's recent motion on July 21st, 2020, to establish an anti-racist policy agenda for Los Angeles County. And so what I'd like to do now is share my screen. And I will just walk you through the website that the county has launched on anti-racism. So folks should be able to see my screen now. This is the Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative website launched by the County Chief Executive Office. You can see the website up here, and I will paste the URL into the chat once I'm done speaking. And this is a page where you can engage with the many things that are happening to establish this anti-racist policy for LA County. As you'll see, you will have a little bit of background. If you click here, it'll take you to the motion itself. And the motion itself has multiple directives in which it first of all declares that racism is a public health crisis in Los Angeles County. Apologies, this is moving a little bit slowly. Maybe I should have clicked on the link. Let me go back to the website because that's the most important thing right now. And it also directs departments to take a close look at their own policies, operations, and procedures to check for anti-racism and to make sure to dismantle any policies and procedures that have been rooted in racism. And what's so important about that is it also helps us to not only take an equity lens or train an equity lens with regard to racism, but also with regard to homophobia, xenophobia, sexism, and other things that may be hindering people from promoting within the County of Los Angeles, and also which may be tainting the way that we provide services to Angelenos. As you scroll down through the site, there is a video also of each supervisor commenting on the passage of the motion, which was unanimously passed on July 21st. It is very rare that an item comes up for the board where every single supervisor speaks. And so if you have a chance to watch this, it's a 2-minute video, but it really represents what each supervisor really thinks of and how they want to commit to anti-racism in the County of Los Angeles. There is a community engagement section. So for those of you who would like to be included in community convenings or would simply like to send an email with some of your recommendations, we encourage you to do so, and you can do that directly through the website. The county department heads have all committed. So there's 37 county departments. All of the department heads are committed to a specific statement that is now on the CEO's website, as well as different things they are doing within their departments so that they can dismantle structural and systemic racism within their departments. And then there are resources and key documents, and we encourage you to click on these and take a look at how you can, from your own position, align with the county's anti-racism policy agenda. And that's pretty much the website. I did want to say that as the supervisor prepares to move over to the city of Los Angeles, there are structures within the city that he intends to stand up to align with the work that the county is doing. So he's not going anywhere on this topic. There are 2 things in particular: the Department of Civil and Human Rights, which is led by Capri Maddox of the city of Los Angeles, as well as the deputy mayor for racial equity, and that is Brenda Shockley, and she will be taking on this work over at the city. At the state level, there are also efforts, as well as at the federal level. As soon as we get a new presidential administration, we expect that there will be much more alignment with what we are doing here. And the goal is to have the county serve as the leader within the nation for anti-racism. As many of you know, Measure J was on the ballot and that passed, and that will allocate between $360 and $900 million a year towards alternatives to law enforcement and alternatives to incarceration. And I have pushed very strongly to make sure that family strengthening and that services for young people and for children are involved in that too. One of the biggest calls to action that I can issue to stakeholders in the child welfare space is to make sure that you have a place at that table. We made sure this last Tuesday, my boss introduced an amending motion to Supervisors Huell and Solis's motion on Measure J to make sure that all of this was aligned around anti-racism. And so as we look at the topic for today, which is really overcoming and eliminating bias in the child welfare system, I think it's only fitting that we have an expert such as Dominique Harrison to speak to us about this. And Dominique brings with her an impressive list of credentials. So I would like to take the opportunity now to say thank you to everyone that I've worked with in the child welfare space and to introduce to you Ms. Dominique Harrison. She is a trainer and curriculum developer at the Department of Mental Health UCLA Prevention Center of Excellence, which is a public-private partnership contract between UCLA and the county's Department of Mental Health. Dominique is known as the racial equity expert on her team, and she strives to have the voices of vulnerable individuals heard. In the last year, Dominique has created curriculums and facilitated online and in-person training sessions for several hundred professionals across LA County. She's a speaker and panelist at conferences, was the co-author of 2 emergency response plans for the city of New York, planned more than 30 events in med tech and healthcare innovation, and worked with 6 UN member countries on their HIV/AIDS workplace programs. Dominique has a master's in public health from New York University, a master's in clinical psychology from Pepperdine, and a Bachelor of Arts in History from Haverford College. So without further ado, I introduce to all of you, Dominique Harrison.
Wow, every time I hear someone give me an introduction, I question, is that me? And I think a lot of us do when we're in a space where we are acknowledging all the things that we've been able to do. And I'm just fortunate to be in everyone's space today. I recognize a number of your names, a number of your agencies. Many of you have, or at least I recognize you. I'm typically the person that does our implicit bias trainings at the DMH UCLA Prevention Center of Excellence. But today we're going to specifically talk to how do we overcome bias to improve recruitment, retention, and quality care, specifically in foster care and child welfare. So I'm Dominique, your host for today. I love doing this work, and hopefully if you have questions, just jot down anything that comes up for you. Allow this to be a reflective space. We're gonna be brave here, so please feel free to share what you want to share in the chat, and I look forward to how you will connect with this work today. So to just kind of ground us in this information, we know that foster care is meant to be an immediate shelter of protection for children who are at risk. But we also need to consider that it's also a confusing and traumatic time of exiting for children from families. So I want to hold both of those things in account today as we go through this information and acknowledge what's going on and how do we support the foster care system. So my goals for today are to help you to increase and build your awareness. And we're gonna work to become more mindful of the conditions that influence our biases. Like I said, I'm a real advocate for brave space. So, we often talk about safe space, but we often know that safe space is not always guaranteed, especially given those who do not have safety in many of their communities, in their racial groups, in their professional settings. So I'd like to honor specifically brave space today. So yes, it's easy to say that we agree to disagree, but what I want us to really work from is a place of reflection and acknowledgement of our discomfort, right? It's easy for me to say no personal attacks, but I really want you to take a moment to distinguish what does it mean to be a person having an idea and the idea itself, right? So listen to understand. So again, something so easy, and I think something we value way too much in American culture is our positive intent or us well-meaning folks. But I really want us to own our intention and own our impact as we do this work. And I want us to really delve deep into honoring different and disagreement most respectfully. So let's jump into the content for today. I know many of you have had an implicit bias training, have an understanding of implicit bias, but again, having one training doesn't mean you're an expert in this, right? We need to continue to relearn, unlearn some of the things that we have learned throughout history to really cement ourselves in this work. So I want us to take a moment to really understand why are biases such a big deal in the work that we do professionally, in the conversations we have, in the relationships that we build professionally and personally. So our individual level thoughts connect to our actions and can often maintain certain discriminatory thought processes. And more acutely, when we believe or what we believe and think of people and communities and racial groups often correlates to our level of engagement and how we interact with those same groups and people. So just to ground us, right, bias is often defined as our tendencies, our inclinations, our feelings, opinions, that often lead us to behave in a certain manner or way. Bias is exceptionally human, right? No one is exempt from bias. Everyone in our world has bias, right? And bias happens explicitly and implicitly. But I want to really hone in on the implicit bias aspect of this, which lurks in the background of every decision that we make. So what is implicit bias? How do we define it? What does it look like? Well, implicit bias is defined as the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, decisions in an unconscious manner. It's activated involuntarily without our awareness or intentional control and can be positive, negative, or neutral. It also reflects a human natural response, our socialization, what we've been exposed to or not exposed to in the communities that we've grown up in, our experiences. And again, everyone has bias, so no one is exempt from it. Okay, I want to take you through a couple of other concepts when it comes to implicit bias. So implicit bias is pervasive. Everyone possesses it, right? It's in the space around us. It's kind of like a fog that we sit in. And even people who are involved in committees and are doing work that's deemed impartial such as judges, have implicit bias, and we have to acknowledge that. So implicit and explicit biases are related, but are distinct mental constructs. They're not mutually exclusive, and they may even enforce or reinforce one another. Implicit associations or bias the implicit associations that we hold do not necessarily always align with our declared or explicit beliefs, or sometimes they may not even reflect stances we would explicitly endorse. A lot of us want a more equitable gender and race world, right? But a lot of times, because of how we've been socialized in our communities, in media, the stories that have been picked up and depicted on TV, how we internalize those stories, our own experiences, may lead us to react, respond, and behave counter to what we explicitly believe. We generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our in-group, those that are similar to us, right? Whether that may mean on a characteristic level, professionally, personally, in the communities that we're in. But through research, we've shown that we can still hold implicit biases against our own in-group. This is often found, for example, in internalized racism. So this happens more and more each day. And we just need to be aware of how it is foundationally and cemented in the way in which we think about our decision-making and our lives. But really, really key here, implicit bias is malleable, meaning our brains have this incredible flexibility, right? That allows us to be able to change the way in which we're seeing, responding, reacting to certain things. If we allow ourselves to slow down, we can really challenge the way that bias comes into our decision-making. And truly, as we challenge ourselves to be more malleable in our thought process around bias, we can start to do this with some of debiasing techniques that I'll show you today. Perspective taking, counter stereotyping, mindfulness, taking an implicit bias association test. All of these things, when done consistently, can really support us in challenging how bias takes place in what we do. Now, just very quickly, I want to take us through a definition of stereotypes, because as you notice, I had stereotypes as a component of how we define implicit bias. So stereotypes are the good enough explanation or the shortcuts for certain objects in our world. I am a big, I love to define things through equations. So you'll see this equation at the bottom. I think it's just another way to really key in on how we define stereotypes, which is society norms, right? Or the stories that society has placed in us, what we've deemed normal in society, plus the way in which our brain pattern recognizes certain instances, experiences, opportunities, really align with how we define stereotypes. So while we may be becoming more aware of how our biases are formed and how we can check on them, acknowledge them, we also need to know that biases can be exacerbated because of these real world everyday challenges, right? So high ambiguity, time constraints, overconfidence in our objectivity. We really need to be honing in on this specifically, because a lot of the things that we've deemed objective in the world are actually subjective, meaning that they have a singular story connected to it and have been deemed true because of those who are in power. So you really need to check in on how we're deciding what's subjective versus objective. And when we're stressed, right? All of these things, whether at the same time or one at a time, can really lead us to make more bias-connected decisions. So we really need to slow down and take a moment to understand what it is that we need to answer in that moment, the questions we have in that moment, who can support us to make better, more thoughtful decisions, and really take the time to be better and be thoughtful. And I love Mahazaren Banaji so much. She's a well-known social psychologist out of Harvard. She actually is one of the main social psychologists out of who created the implicit bias association test. And she says here, even the most well-meaning person unwittingly allows unconscious thoughts and feelings to influence seemingly objective decisions. So take a moment to really parse through that. even the most well-meaning, all of us are well-meaning in this space, especially those of us who have taken it upon ourselves to really protect and care and provide safety and security for children. Even the most well-meaning of us unwittingly allow unconscious thoughts and feelings to influence seemingly objective decisions. Okay, so I actually, before I give you all the goods, which I would call the strategies, I really think it's important that we take a moment to understand the history of the child welfare system, and specifically how it led us to our current system of foster care and child welfare, and how we look at how we care for system-involved youth. So we need to understand our past, obviously, to really challenge the way in which we see our present. And maybe that's disproportionality of Black and brown children in the system, or how are we maintaining recruiting and caring for resource parents at this time. This is all about how do we do the work that we're sitting here together doing it better. So let's jump into this knowing. I think it's really important to start with what happened to kids throughout history when they either had parents that they lost due to illness, who were impoverished and could not provide for them. What happened to these kids? Where did they go? Well, many of us are familiar with the orphan trains in the 1800s and how they shipped about, I think it was around 1,500 children to the Midwest to work on farms. So a lot of these children who were deemed like their parents couldn't provide for them, or their parents died, they sent them to these places to be a part of the work, to support farmlands and all these other additional things. There was nothing really to protect the children. We didn't know what was going on, but we just had a plan. We wanted these kids to go and be useful parts of the community. So first we see these children as indentured workers, so to speak. Then we have our first orphanages in the mid 1800s to late 1900s, and these orphanages were really started by private religious and charitable organizations, right? But there were things that we seen in orphanages that were really, problematic. So we thought, let's figure out a way to really get these children into safe homes. So foster homes started to be made in the early 1900s. And what we saw from like the 1900s to like 1960s was our first introduction to child welfare, abuse and neglect policy, specific consideration around how do we care for children temporarily as we remove them from the home. But what I want us to note about foster homes is something that I learned from Dr. Jessica Price. She talks about in her work or connects W.E.B. Du Bois, and he worked with a group of students to go into foster homes and really decide what it is that we're seeing when we look at these foster homes. And three things he used to characterize these foster homes. One, some of them were grossly inadequate, meaning some children were really not receiving the basic needs in these new homes. Two, some were a bit more humane, right? And three, and there were a select few that were loving and human homes. However, what we often saw disproportionately that Black and brown children were found in more of the grossly inadequate homes. So, you'll also see in alignment that in the 1900s, we really were about highlighting some policies to really get to the heart of supporting these children. So I don't go through the exhaustive list of policies here. As you know, there's a number of things that happened in the 1900s around child welfare and foster care to support children. But let's start with the Social Security Act, right? 1935, it's around the authorization of the first federal grants for child welfare services, right? But federal specifically. And then this was supposed to be like the main motivation for states to start to establish their own child welfare agencies and practices and programs. Then we have the Aid to Dependent Children, which was really about helping states to identify how they're going to provide financial assistance and services to these dependent children that we deemed were in need. Now, I want to take a moment because I'm actually going to highlight two policies and then I'm going to get your advice. So bear with me and listen closely as I explain specifically the Aid to Dependent Children with the Foster Care Amendment and the Adoption and Safe Families Act. So, but I'm going to continue and give you a description of all of them. So bear with me. But the Aid to Dependent Children Foster Care was an amendment added on to the Aid to Dependent Children policy, which was came around the 1960s. But it basically designated specific money to those who were placed in temporary care. However, federal reimbursement was really limited to cases who were deemed already getting money from the Aid to Dependent Children policy and who remained in the home. So key in on that, who are already receiving ADC specific payments and who remained in the home. Now, CAPTA, or the Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act of 1974 or so, is where Congress really started to enact policy around how are we federally addressing child abuse and neglect. So this is really about, in exchange for federal funding for child abuse prevention and treatment, right, where CAPTA is requiring that states establish child abuse reporting procedures, investigation systems. But what we also know from this is that there was a result in a rapid growth in the number of children who were removed from homes and placed in foster care. Now, the Adoption and Safe Families Act, or ASFA, is of like 96, 97, if I'm correct. These key provisions around ASFA were designed to ensure, now hear me when I say this, child safety, permanency, and well-being of paramount concern in any child welfare decision, right? So key in on safety, permanency, and well-being. Right, so we're talking about how are we encouraging states to expedite permanency decisions for child care and for children in foster care? How are we promoting, incentivizing, and increasing the number of adoptions, particularly through new adoption incentives, right? A specific payment program. And it's also about like how are states establishing accountability around their system, where states are facing financial penalties for failure to remove children from homes who they deemed unsafe. Now, lastly, the foster connection to the foster connections to success to increasing adoptions was around 2008. And what we all pretty much know is that this was really focused on how are we honoring kinship relationships, relatives of those children who've been removed from their families. How are we honoring relatives to have their relatives in their home? How are we helping to provide services for these families to really connect to these children? Okay, so now that you've heard all of that, I know, take a moment to let it settle within you. And I want you to really see how we're describing these two policies specifically, the Aid to Dependent Children Foster Care and ASFA. So for ADFC or ADCFC, I'm going to say for today, Congress authorized federal funds for foster care payments made on behalf of children who were removed from unsuitable homes. Key in on those words, removed from unsuitable homes. And Congress worked to continue to aid the child in the home, right? Didn't say aid the family, but aid specifically the child, while making arrangements for the child to live elsewhere. Now, ASFA specifically is around ensuring child safety, permanency, well-being. It's around encouraging states to expedite permanency decisions, promoting and increasing the number of adoptions, right, and the adoptive incentive program. So now, with all that in mind, I want you to, in the chat, and think about this reflectively, think about what comes up for you, but what are some of the biases that we can start to identify in those policies specifically? Again, I'm happy to go back to the definition so you guys can look at the wording of it and what are we noticing, but what are some of the biases that we notice from these two policies specifically? And we'll take about a minute or so. Let's see what comes through on the chat. And again, my question is, what are some of the biases in how each policy is languaged that we're noticing in? So what's unsuitable? Absolutely. And who is defining unsuitable, right? I think, great, thank you for sharing. Unsuitable is open to interpretation. Absolutely. I think I know for myself when I read that, unsuitable was like, who's defining unsuitable? Who are we, government, state level entities defining unsuitable? Are we creating conversations or having conversations with the family to understand what we, or let them know how we're defining unsuitable? Promoting adoption impacts kin relationships. Absolutely. It absolutely does. And while you're sharing, I'm just gonna share a few thoughts from myself about what comes up for me as I think about both of these policies. So for the first one, the ADFC foster care, we see that Congress is authorizing payments for foster care for those who were eligible originally for ADC funding, right? And that criteria is incredibly biased already. And what constitutes as an unsuitable home? I think everyone asked that question. And how are our definitions connected to our negative thoughts around certain culture groups and how we believe them to care for or not to care for their family members? And additionally, for Congress to continue to aid the child in the home, but while also making, making arrangements for that child to be removed and live elsewhere is incredibly disheartening, right? We're only giving money in support to the child, not to the family in which they remain. And we're still making strides to get them out of that home. And based off of what criteria? Are we creating spaces for family to actually have a space to support their children? Or are we even creating spaces for us for families who we are deeming are unsafe or unfit to define what their strengths are and to build on those strengths? And then specifically with ASFA, I think one of the things is like, how are we defining child safety? Have we discussed with the family and the children what safety looks like for them? And are we imposing our state level and governmental level perceptions and our values of safety on a family? And then specifically, why is expediting child relocation outside of a kinship home or relative, how is that being prioritized? Why are we prioritizing that? And why are we not looking to help the child maintain a connection with their kinship? Okay, so a lot of thoughts, okay? And I'll continue to leverage a lot of your comments in the chat. So thank you so much for getting us started. So I want to talk through intention versus impact a little bit. Oh, wait. Nope, that's it. Okay, so I want to start with, I'm going to give you a vignette, and I want to walk us through what comes up for you as you hear me read over this vignette, right? And I want you to ask yourself these three questions. 1, does society value good intentions over the impact of our actions? Does society value good intentions over the impact of our actions? 2, does the intent of our actions matter if our actions have the impact of furthering the marginalization or the oppression of those around us? And then 3, can our privilege, right, professionally, personally, family-wise, community-wise, can our privilege shield us from understanding the impact of our actions? Okay, so take those 3 questions in mind. I'll repeat them after I finish reading the vignette, but consider those 3 questions as you hear me read over this vignette about the lovely Johnson family and Brianna and Desmond. So Brianna, age 9, and Desmond, age 7, were removed from their home after their mother was reported for child abuse and neglect. The children are placed temporarily with their grandmother, but eventually placed with the Johnsons, a resource family. The Johnsons live over 30 plus miles away from their mother and grandmother. Their mother and grandmother have no way of visiting Brianna and Desmond, have no car. It's really challenging to get there by public transportation. Keep all of these things in mind. Although the Johnsons share some cultural similarities to Brianna and Desmond, the Johnsons are Black, they're California natives, They do not attend church like Desmond and Brianna, that they're used to that. They are more relaxed in their parenting style. Desmond and Brianna are, accustomed to a little bit more not so relaxed parenting style. And the Johnsons cook meals that Brianna and Desmond are not used to specifically. But the Johnsons are well known within the resource family community. They've been resource parents for years, right? They're known as model resource parents who have fostered for years with many families and have had really great outcomes, right? We know that. They have a big home, they live in a safe neighborhood, and have met and have always met the state and agency level criteria each time they fostered. Okay, so reflect on this vignette with me. Reflect on the vignette with me. And remember the 3 questions I asked you. Does society value good intentions over the impact of our actions? Does the intent of our actions matter if our actions have the impact of furthering the marginalization or oppression of those around us? And can our privilege shield us from understanding the impact of our actions? Okay. So in the chat, I'd love to hear some of the positive outcomes that you think will happen for these children who are placed with the Johnsons. What are some positive things that could happen, right? There's definitely some positive things. So please feel free to share out in the chat what your thoughts are. And again, no answer is a wrong answer. I'm just here to see what's coming up for you. So great, thank you for that comment. They are experienced foster parents, right? So they have experiences, resources that they'll be provided, absolutely. Absolutely. So that's one of the biggest things I think we want to honor, right? That the children will be placed together. It's often really common that, and really challenging and hard in LA County for siblings to stay together. So that's really great that they're going to stay together. Safe home, absolutely. Absolutely, safe home. Okay. Now I'd like for you to take a moment and think about what are some potentially negative impacts for the children who are placed with the Johnsons? And again, share that in the chat. What could happen? What are some negative things that we could see happening here? Distance from their biological family, absolutely. Trauma of being removed from parents, absolutely. Limited visitation, disconnection from culture, absolutely. And yes, so it sounds like you guys are right in agreement with me here. And cultural disconnection, faith practices, yes. So leaving, not connected to their loving family. So great, thank you so much for all of your wonderful shares. So if you remember that question, a couple of questions that I asked about, but I want to hone in on that one question. Does the intent of our actions matter if our actions have the impact of furthering the marginalization or oppression of those around us? And does it matter? Absolutely not. We have to value the impact so much more here. We need to take a moment to really collaborate with those around us to be able to support better, more positive outcomes with children. All right. So just a couple of final thoughts that I think are really, really important when doing this work, specifically around just the concept of impact versus intent. So we need to, as providers, as those who are on committees to support the relocation of children, to support resource parents being new resource parents, recruitment, retention, we need to first reflect on how are we valuing more risk-averse thinking rather than risk tolerance. Now, many of us know that if you've worked in social welfare, if you've, had the, are a social worker and go into a home, there are things that are always going to be triggering for you when it comes to whether or not I remove a child or not. But we have to realize that a lot of the things, there are a lot of ways in which we make decisions are dealt with or connected to potentiality. We don't know necessarily. Our fears often drive family separation, which is really upsetting. And we need to consider that in every aspect of life for those who are supporting or new families, that there is risk. There's risk in parenting. We need to listen reflectively and consider what a family's protective factors are. We can't just go into a family and say, you know, you're doing all these things wrong, your kids will be taken away from you. Can we create spaces where we can say, I want to honor your strengths here. I want to talk about whether or not you need help with building parental resilience. Or let's talk about the social connections that you have. Or do you know about how your child is developing? And is there more resources that we can provide for you in this way? What are some concrete supports that we can provide that are within your community? Now, absolutely want to honor this. We need to partner with rather than dictate to. When I think about resource parents, right, those who are really thinking about becoming resource parents, we need to think about, are we asking them just to check boxes, or are we really collaborating with them and partnering alongside them to acknowledge what it is that they want their new family to look like? How are they going to support these new children that come into their home? We need to be collaborative. We need to be inclusive. We need to stop being dictatorial about our decision making. And we need to involve biological caregivers in the recruitment process. Now, this is really important, and I think there are more policies now that are highlighting kinship and relatives to be the next step when we think about how children are removed from home. But we need to really keep this in mind, because history has taught us that we've never really valued kinship. We've never really valued relatives. So we need to take the steps necessary to really honor this. Okay. So here we are. We've gotten to the strategies portion, and I really want to talk through this with you all and really connect to what it is that we should be doing when it comes to overcoming how our biases can have an impact on our decisions. So I first want to talk through, like, what are some things that we can do interpersonally, right? What can we do individually as we sit here today? What are some of the things that we can start doing that can help us to challenge our biases? Well, for one, you could take some IATs, which are the implicit association tests. Many of us know what these are, so I don't have to, go into depth about what they are. But if you'll remember my reference to Dr. Banerjee, who out of Harvard, she was one of the main social psychologists who created Project Implicit to support the creation of these IATs. You can be mindful, take up a mindfulness practice. You can learn to perspective take. This is really valuable. And I think this is something that we all know we can do, and that we're actually doing right now. Have the necessary conversations about bias and racism. Do not stray away from this. This is so valuable. And it's funny because, sometimes when we're looking for strategies, we're always like, I don't know what to do. I need to do something now. These are things that you can do right now. Even some of you may even look on projectimplicit.com right now while you're in this presentation and even think about taking an assessment as soon as possible. So here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to walk you through all of these strategies and really define how more distinctly we can do this work. So first, the IATs, created by Project Implicit in 1998. They were started by 3 scientists, as they're called: Tony Greenwald out of the University of Washington, Mazarin Banerjee, as I stated before, and Brian Nosek. And also, if you're really familiar with Banerjee, Dr. Banerjee and Tony Greenwald, they're also the writers of the book Blind Spot, which I would heavily recommend when it comes to really acknowledging what implicit bias is. And so they created the IATs. The IATs they measure the strength of associations between specific concepts like Black and white individuals, or those who we've defined like specific characteristics, right? And then they're given an evaluative property. So how we evaluate them as good or bad, for example, right? Or certain other stereotypes and how we deem them necessary. And Project Implicit has about 15 or so assessments right now. And just to give you an example of how they're defined, the race IAT, it requires the ability to distinguish faces of European and African descent. So you'll see on the next slide, I'll show you what that looks like when you go to take the assessment. And then, for example, with weight, this IAT requires the ability to distinguish faces of people who are what we have defined as obese and people who we define as thin. Now, many of us, after taking IATs, feel any one of these common reactions, right? Some of us are in disbelief, like, I don't even believe that can be me, right? I have explicit beliefs that are connected to positive outcomes, right? Positive ways of thinking about Black individuals, positive ways of thinking about those who we define as obese or thin, right? But again, the more we take it, the more we will feel accepting of what we're seeing. So common reactions: disregard, distress, discomfort. So I want you to take a moment to look at what the IAT, what you'll see when you start an IAT. Specifically, this is the race IAT. Now, IATs are broken up into about 5 to 7 parts, depending on which test you take. But in the first part, you're sorting the words relative to the concepts. So the concepts here are African Americans and European Americans. And then in the second part of the IAT, you sort the words relative to how we evaluate them, right? Whether they're good or whether we've deemed them bad, right? And then in the third part of the IAT, the categories are combined, right? So instead of just saying, African Americans good and European Americans bad or vice versa, it's going to be like good African Americans, bad European Americans, or vice versa. Now, again, there's a sort of like sorting property that happens when you take the assessment, that everyone's test doesn't look the same as they're taking it. And really it's just testing how fast you're able to connect the keys specified for the assessment. And then the last 2 portions, they're going to switch the concepts. So if you had bad African Americans and good European Americans first, they'll switch the evaluative property, and then you'll see good African Americans and bad European Americans. And it's really about testing how fast or quickly you're able to associate those evaluative properties, okay? All right, any questions about IATs? That is like the quickest way I've ever explained it. But again, feel free to go on the Project Implicit website to learn more about what it is that the IATs can help you learn more about yourself. Now, I want to take a moment to really talk about mindfulness. Mindfulness is something that I think a lot of us are like, what does it look like when we challenge our biases through mindfulness? And for me, it's about we are being intentional about creating a space to complete meditations that speak positively, compassionately, and thoughtfully about marginalized cultures. And with time and effort and space, we can start to alter the way our biases affect whether we deem something as negative or positive. And a lot of this has to do with how we potentially see our in-groups. So we're creating a space to think about those who are different from us, race, ethnicity-wise, privilege, power-wise, socioeconomic status-wise, able-bodied, different religious or national origins, religious thought processes. And we're thinking about them in a more loving and kind manner. So I want to give you a quick acronym that I think could be helpful as you start to do the work of mindfulness. And I really learned it from Rhonda McGee. She's a lawyer out of NYU. She wrote a really phenomenal book on mindfulness and racial justice. And so she has this acronym. I added the extra N because I think that there is some significance about separating the 2 N's that she determines, but I just want to walk you through the acronym. So first, we should recognize. Recognizing means we pause, we observe from all angles, the obvious ones and the not so obvious angles, right? We're recognizing is really about deepening our perception, our understanding, to be more effective and to understand the pain that we're seeking to address in the world to make it more of a joyful, beautiful, and thoughtful world. Then I'd like to have us accept, right, or to allow. We want to release any tendency we have in our minds and our bodies to reject, to deny, to change, to be at war with something in our deemed reality. Accepting is not that we accept something forever, right? That is not what I'm saying here. Accepting really means just taking a moment to slow down, right? To pause long enough for us to be able to let in some of the things that we don't often think about. So it's about, we're preluding to really looking at something more deeply. We're looking to understand, not to respond to something or react specifically. Then I'd ask that we investigate, right? Many of us are investigators in our own mind. We're inquisitive, we're asking questions, we're trying to learn and know more. But we have to think about this compassionately, courageously. We need to learn, and we have the capacity to grow in self-awareness and empathy and wisdom. If we continue to ask ourselves, like, what's going on when I'm hearing something? What's causing me to think this way? What are the physical sensations that I'm experiencing in my body? What are the emotions that are coming up? Why did I have that thought? We can really start to challenge what comes up for us. And the N stands for non-identity. This is really crucial because we need to actually separate how we place certain evaluative properties, like I connected with the IATs of good and bad, away from certain concepts. So this non-identification is about increasing our mind's flexibility. We already talked about how flexible our minds are, right? Our biases are malleable. So learning to let go of the tendencies to get stuck in or to identify with thoughts and emotions. We need to uncover this process. We need to be non-judgmental. We need to non-attach, right? And that looks like we are liberating ourselves from like putting all of these thought processes onto one concept. And we're giving ourselves the freedom to say, I'm going to let this pass. I'm going to give myself time to slow down, to really process and reflect on what's coming up for me, and to know that everything's going to be okay. And it's funny how quickly that happens in our brain. So RAIN is really contingent upon intention, right? Deep change, when we go from mindlessness to mindfulness, is about starting with deep intention. We really need to be able to feel that we have the capacity and the ability to grow and to change. And RAIN is about stepping up to view all of ourselves as capable human beings who can be more healthy, more whole, more free, and to really be able to see everyone as a whole component of our community. Okay, so perspective taking. And this is a big one. I think a lot of us have an understanding of perspective taking. It's a concept that we're familiar with in other professional entities that we've been a part of. Our understanding of perspective taking, we've learned it from probably a young age, right? But perspective taking is still a really powerful tool to improve our negative attitudes. But in addition to taking the perspective of another person, for example, who may be from a minority or marginalized group, what we're doing is we must consider the ways in which we have prioritized our in-group considerations, characteristics, and have made them more prototypical or normal in reference to those who are in the deemed out group or minority group or marginalized group. So this strategy is really involving us taking the steps to perspective take in the first person of a member of a stereotype group. And this usually helps us to be more psychologically flexible and brings us closer to the challenges of that stigmatized group. So a couple of key tips here when we think of perspective taking. So please slow down. This is something I often talk about. I think I probably say slow down in all of my implicit bias trainings 1,000 times, but slow down. Take a moment to determine what's leading you to think that way. What's coming up for you? Reflect that your privilege, your advantages, your access will have an impact on how you're seeing the situation. And also understand that every individual's identities mirrors a unique set of opportunities and challenges and experiences. So really slow down, reflect, and understand. Now, to make this a little bit more distinct to who we are, how we support the foster care network, and really support system-involved youth, continue to reflect on your imbalanced reciprocal or balanced power relationships. This is key, right? Everyone knows about power theory or has an idea of power theory, right? And how are we developing these relationships? What do our relationships look like? Are they collaborative? Are we asking people to check boxes? Are we creating spaces for them to determine what their criteria are? Are we giving them the opportunity to define their strengths? Are we giving them the space to ask questions? We need to recognize that meaning well is not enough. I think this ties into our intention versus impact conversation. But again, meaning well, you know, we have to highlight and hone in on our impact. We need to be more specific and more timely with connecting what happens, what are some of the outcomes that we're seeing, and really take a moment to reflect on that. We need to redirect our protection of the privileged. Now, one of my favorite writers, her name is Tressie McMillan McCottom. She's actually a recent MacArthur Grant Scholar this year, and I listen to Here to Slay. It's a really great podcast. And I want to hone in on something that I heard her say in a podcast episode, and she talked about voting. And she says, well, whenever I vote, my mindset is I vote for the lower income Black woman, meaning she thinks about all of her decisions around voting in the mindset of those who are under-resourced, undervalued, and are actually in the minority, right? So she makes decisions to protect the underprivileged, not the privileged. So we need to think that way. We need to really value what we're going to do in this space and honor that the privileged will be okay. We just need to make space for those who are subjugated. And resist the false notion of equality. Oh, this is big. I know, we have in many of our work, we talk about the difference between equality and equity. But again, this is really, we need to do this work. We need to resist the false notion of equality. We need to refuse to be silent. We need to also, and when I say this, we need to also know what are the situations that we see ourselves being the most silent. This is really, really important. If we are finding ourselves in situations where we don't have the skills, the strategies, the capacity, the fulfillment, the wherewithal to speak up, we need to figure out why. And we need to challenge ourselves with people we trust, having more conversations about bias and racism to really start to challenge silence. Okay, so I'm gonna keep us moving because I wanna talk through the last couple of, I love it, I'm sorry, I'm seeing the chat, and yes, I can talk more about Here to Slay for all of those who are interested, but definitely a powerful podcast. But continue to add this in the chat, but I'm gonna move us forward. What are some things that you could start to do today to intercept your biases in resource parent recruitment and retention? After thinking about all the ways in which I talked about perspective taking, what are some of the things you can start to do today to really support yourselves to make better non-biased decisions? And then also, and I always think it's really great to reflect on what our privileges are leading us to do. So think about what privileges you hold and think about how they're affecting you in your decision making. And feel free, as you feel comfortable, share out what's your thoughts in the chat. I think many of us will value some of your thoughts. Okay, and then lastly, for the individual tools and strategies, have the conversations about bias and racism. This is something, if this is not one of your strategies in any, then I don't know what's happening. But really just start having the conversations. I think many of us who started off our conversation today talked about the importance of having conversations, whether it looks like after a video, in creating that brave space to be able to say, let's talk about what's happening in our world. We're seeing this lived out on a very distinct media purported way. We need to bring it into the room. We need to bring it into our professional relationships. We need to honor what's happening to the children, system-involved children and resource parents who we can't retain because they don't feel like they're being provided resources. We need to be revolutionary, not just evolutionary in our thought processes about this. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples around bias and racism discussion prompts. And again, I imagine you guys have some of your own, but these are just like 3 examples of some things you can start to have conversations about today when it comes to having discussions. Again, if you are at a place where you're like, you know what, I'm not comfortable with having these conversations yet with my professional space, think about those who you trust and start to have conversations in your personal space. It could be family members, it could be colleagues that you really value, who you have really good conversations with, who honor your thought processes, and then start to have them practice having these conversations, right? I think that's really important. You don't have to always come into something on the fly. You can actually have a statement identified and written out. So just 3 prompts, like, what difficulties do resource parents with marginalized identities experience, right? What are some of the first thoughts that come to mind when a child needs placement due to DCFS involvement? And then how does society view potential resource parents' history of criminality? Again, those are 3 very different prompts, but I think that if considering having conversations in your offices today, with your, in a team meeting, you could bring it up in a team meeting, and see what comes up from asking these questions. A couple of other things that you can consider would be, what could a conversation about the history of child welfare come to mind? Like, what happens when we start to talk about and really be thoughtful about the history of child welfare and how it's led us to where we are today? Or, are we in our offices, in our communities, are we prioritizing placement with biological families or with out-of-home, non-kinship individuals? What are some of our notions about, our preconceived notions about resource parent recruitment? What's coming up for us when we think about these things? So again, feel free to take this. This is for you. For those of you who came on late, I will make sure that everyone has a PDF copy who was on today's session. We'll have a PDF copy of this training. So again, feel free to use this to your heart's content, but definitely copyright DMH UCLA because that's where I am working from. But again, please feel free to use these prompts. I think it goes without saying. And, I want you to reflect and feel free if you want to jot down some thoughts in the chat for your counterparts here. What are some additional bias and racist prompts that are helpful when starting conversations with colleagues, friends, and families? Again, it might not look how I gave them. It could actually be even broader. Like, maybe what are some of our first stories of race in our lives, right? What are some of the, when's the first time I realized I was a person of color? Or when was the first time I was silenced when I saw someone from a different community? What was that? What did that feel like? So create spaces where you can start to have these conversations and come up with your own bias and racism prompts to start to do this work. Okay, now to end us off for today, I really just want to give us some policy considerations when we are thinking about overcoming bias in how we do the work of foster care and support for system-involved youth. So bottom line, let's see how much we can support kinship inclusion and placement decisions. You know, I think I've said this enough, but I think it's really important that when we do this work, we are honoring kinship inclusion. You know, from the 2008 policy that I talked about, the foster care connections, I can't remember the full name, but you guys get me. But it was really about stripping away some of that really high level criteria when we thought about involving relatives in temporary and foster care for you know, children that we're placing outside of the home. Really support these kinship inclusions. Do not do things silently. Create spaces where you can have conversations with biological families. Preserve the relational connection between children and family. Do this to your heart's content, please. This is so valuable. We want to make sure that children know that they can still have conversations, can still see their biological families, can still be a part of the community in which they were removed from. Remember that it's traumatic to be removed from that. So any way that we can provide them with that sense of security and safety, that they can have those relationships still, is really vital. And, you know, I think it's always important that we dare to share power. Think about ways to be collaborative in our power sharing. Let's be more balanced in our relationships. Let's be facilitators and collaborators and highlight the strengths that families have. Let's provide them information when children are taken out of the home and when children are placed back with their biological families. Let's give them every single decision-making process. Let's provide for them the negative outcomes and the positive outcomes. We need to be as forthcoming and as thoughtful when we are in relationship with families. So dare to share power. And lastly, just, you know, consider a prevention mindset rather than a crisis mindset. This is hard because a lot of our policies historically have been created out of crisis. All right, we need this because we know that children are being harmed, or parents are unfit, or, you know, parents who are living in poverty are not providing what we deem as safe and secure and provisional places for children. But what we really need to do is really think, how can we highlight the strengths, protective factors of family, so that we can actually be more along the lines of preventative thought processes rather than a crisis mindset. Okay? Did you get all of that? I know that was a lot, but really start to think about ways in which you can highlight these considerations in your organizations. Okay, and to end us off, I'm a lover of James Baldwin, so I think many of us know this quote, but we faced a lot today. And we know that nothing can be changed until it's faced. So really take a moment to really reflect on what it is that you want to do. What is your role in this community? How are you supporting system-involved youth? How are you supporting kinship relatives? And how are you prioritizing permanency? Who's given incentives, adoptive parents or foster care parents? Are we asking parents about their what their needs are? So not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And with that, I thank you all. I know that was a lot of information, but again, you do have access to the PDF, so feel free to use that to your heart's content. Just remember to quote DMH UCLA, Prevention Center of Excellence, when you do. And I think that is it for me. I'm going to stop my share so I can see some of your lovely faces. And thank you for the time. Okay, and I think I'm supposed to give you guys a heads up that there is going to be one other session. But again, in preparing for this presentation, I didn't remember the name of next week's session. So if anyone on our our team can provide the information for the next session, that would be great, the name of it. It's going to be next Thursday. For those of you who've registered before, you'll see it in on the Foster Together Network register page, and it should be around the same time. So thank you all. Really enjoyed my time with you. If you have any further questions for me, I'm going to put my email in the chat so you all can connect. And I thank you so much.
And the upcoming session is the youth panel. It's being put together by Tamara Hunter and Keela Burton. It should be incredibly powerful, so we look forward to having you all join us there.
Thank you, Rochelle. I really needed that. And it looks like I'm going to send my email really quickly. Thank you all.